ever judge you because nobody calls me? Like, I used to judge meeting attendance by phone calls and interest. I hear they just talk to each other and then show up.
I expect it's on either full or empty.
Yeah, that was my.
Powers that be, they'll do whatever they want. That is an
Mr. Hale, welcome to your first meeting.
That is.
We took it easy on you.
You know, Jesse, it seems like there's been a vigorous debate. How's William,
John,
Jesse?
he's doing great.
Good.
Nobody here thought they cared. Just a couple hundred. It did not happen quietly.
What happened quietly is
It's very.
an up alley resource.
I told you, it's like,
Right.
Without
no, your meeting is screening
participation,
now.
interest.
This is the first meeting that.
HD quality too,
All my like,
so you can see
This is
everything.
like nipples and.
Coming for years.
I'm like, oh,
My
my
double
gosh.
chin,
Just gonna be Mr.
Are
Brady.
we on right now?
Grumpy
Yeah.
Rich.
YouTube,
Okay. Can they hear us?
Yeah,
yeah.
well, let's.
Also trans, the county's keeping
And that's
part of
the-
the property.
It's always live.
The golf course, but the county transfer
You should treat every microphone that way anyway.
the contract from the county fair to the city of California.
Okay then, my job is done.
You don't want to
I'm out of here.
Will
You wanna stay?
Council let Lake County.
I told her, I said she's more than welcome.
The county had a contract with an entity to provide the county fair.
So, in the end, I just have to go complete and I'm done.
So then wait for your DVD and then wait for him to
The
catch you with
USB,
the
so then we'll be getting back to USB.
We're giving an update. Facebook.
Okay. I'll call you,
Tweet, there we
So you
go.
want me checked
How
out?
was the sailing?
I don't have either one of those.
It was so awesome.
yes, that's it.
Sailing on the bay.
Yeah, very Saturday.
Cindy, did you see
I woke up.
the packet that I gave?
I did, it's right here. Thank you, I forgot about it. Thanks for bringing it
It's
back.
like a little bit, but one more product. One more time, the first night I changed platforms twice right now.
Aaron and Aaron's sister and I are going on a little walk after the.
Well, that's just.
So we get there.
This Aaron?
Yeah.
He's not coming to me. Did you already have a commitment?
I talked to him last week. Yeah.
I let him off the hook. Battery.
Because he's like, I really want to look at the lighting and it's the same way to market. And I was like, great. Well, yeah.
We'll go ahead and do it.
Okay, great.
But his dog is having.
Yes.
He has a diabetic lab.
Not exactly the other I was expecting, but hey.
Not regular issue. He was literally out of it and trying to figure out.
Do they have a camera to clear the code?
First off,
What, yeah, the Coast Guard has to inspect boats to make sure that all the safety
the
equipment.
biggest projects, nobody shows up. Tell me about it.
The short.
That's 'cause it's fill the room.
It's Christmas.
There's no
Fill the room with the fence issue, nobody shows up for the biggest project.
The longer it gets.
No, one of my very first bosses used to talk about that, like the smallest
Yeah.
projects.
That, how big is it? On San Francisco Bay.
Yeah, that's here, people should, and also. Hi. But no, you're those folks are rich by the-
That's,
So I'm expecting at least one, likely two. There's on the left. That's it. Perfect.
Now we're starting now.
no, it's six.
Work together.
I'm going to call the meeting to order. And I'll ask our newest commissioner, Dan, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ms. Gamera, would you please take the roll?
Commissioner Monette,
Here, Monette.
Commissioner Pont,
Here.
Commissioner Hale,
Here.
Vice Chair Knudsen,
Present.
Chair Hardy.
Here. I'm thinking I should do the public forum before we move on. Yes. Noah has nodded his head wisely. This is time for the public forum. This is a time for members of the public to speak to matters that are not on tonight's agenda. And because they are not on tonight's agenda, the commission cannot make any substantive response. Is there anyone who would like to address the commission during the public forum? Seeing none, we'll move right on. Noah, would you like to introduce the general plan subject?
Yes, definitely, Chair Hardy. However, there is one item on the consent calendar, the adoption of the minutes.
I forgot the minutes. Is there anyone who would like to pull? Change microphone. Is there anyone who would like to?
Push it a little further away.
Is there anyone? Consent agenda. This is an opportunity for either commissioners or members of the public to request additional discussion.
That's right.
I see none. Is there a motion?
I'll move the consent calendar. Second.
Ms. Gamera, would you please take the roll?
Commissioner Pont,
Yes.
Commissioner Hale,
Yes.
Commissioner Monette,
Yes.
Vice Chair Knudsen,
Yes.
Chair Hardy.
Yes. Moving right along and hating my microphone. Director Hausch, would you please?
Thank you, Chair Hardy, members of the commission and the public. The only hearing before the commission this evening is a public hearing to accept comments on the St. Helena 2040 General Plan EIR. The comment period for this document is ranging from October 23rd of this year to January 2nd of 2019. There are copies of the EIR available at both City Hall and the library if someone would like to read a hard copy. Digital copies are on the website, and the city can provide CDs for folks who would like to provide their own digital copies or get them printed. Written comments are being asked to be provided directly to the planning department. My contact information is available in the packet associated with this item, as well as on the city website, and I'm happy to provide it to anyone who is interested. The EIR before the public requesting comments on is intended to analyze the environmental impacts of the proposed draft 2040 general plan and looks at 3 study areas just beyond the city boundaries, which are contiguous. Catherine Pran is here this evening representing the consulting firm Dayton Bhatia, who the city contracted with to conduct the EIR analysis. And just briefly, I'd like to remind everyone that the intent of this meeting and the comment period itself is to hear comments on the scope of the EIR and its adequacy, as well as the resulting findings and mitigation measures. General plan comments are welcome. However, the final policy direction for the 2040 general plan was provided by the Planning Commission and City Council through a combination of meetings that occurred in February, March, and August of this year. And there's significant background in the staff report attached to this item regarding that. And this draft EIR is based on that finalized policy direction. policy comments that are made by the public or even the commission that were not addressed in the general plan are being tracked by staff and will be brought back for future policy discussions at the behest or request of the planning commission or city council. So I'm going to turn it over to Catherine to provide a brief presentation, after which we will open up the public hearing for discussion and questions from the planning commission as well as the public. And just to remind everyone that all comments that are received during this comment period, both written and verbal, will be responded to as part of the final draft EIR, which will be presented to the Planning Commission for recommendation to the City Council, and that will be in early 2019. Staff does not have a date yet. However, February, one of the meetings in February is likely the earliest that would occur. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine, and thank you very much.
Hello, thank you. So I'm Catherine Pan. I'm a senior associate with Dighton Bhatia. So I'm going to give you a really quick presentation touching on some of the things that Noah has already shared with you to set the stage for any public comment that we might be receiving tonight. So the main goal of this meeting is to receive comments from the public on the EIR analysis on the general plan update. Any comments received tonight have to ideally focus on the environmental issues covered in the EIR and not on the plan. As Noah mentioned, those will be accepted in writing by the city, but we will not be going over those tonight. So here's a quick outline. We'll just go over briefly the project description and the status of the project, the environmental review process, the EIR public review period and comment process, and also the next steps. So the project in question, so the one that's covered in the draft EIR, is the general plan update for 2040. This project is intended to replace the current general plan, which was adopted back in 1993. So this particular project began in 2007, and there was a draft produced in 2010. Since then, there have been some additional feedback from Planning Commission and City Council, and also some additional state regulations that have come out. So at the beginning of this year, we began updating the update to cover those topics, and also updated the EIR to improve its adequacy, and also to include some information on 3 unincorporated study areas that are adjacent to the city. So you can see those on the next slide. But the 2018 draft general plan update and also this draft EIR, as Noah mentioned, are both available on the city's website and also at the at City Hall and the public library. So really quickly, this is the proposed land use map for the draft general plan. And so these are all land use designations, most of which are carried over from the existing general plan. Any changes are really focused on those hashed areas in the center and up in that flood control area. Here's a list of the elements covered in the general plan. So the project goes over land use and growth management, economic sustainability, public facilities and services, circulation, historic resources, community design, open space conservation, public health, safety and noise, climate change, parks and recreation, arts, culture, and entertainment. A lot of these are actually required by state law, and some of them are just optional elements that cover topics that are of import to the local community. This project does not include the housing element that was recently adopted already in 2015. It's on a separate schedule through HCD, so it's not included. So here's a look at where we are in the environmental review process. So this began back in April. We released the notice of preparation with some information about the project, and also a request for comments on the scope of the EIR. And there was a scoping period of about 30 days, no, exactly 30 days from the time that was released. And we had a scoping meeting here at the time where we received some comments from the public and also Planning Commission on topics that would be important to cover as part of the EIR process. Then we went back and did the environmental review itself. So that was most of the summer and also some of the spring and fall to take a look at potential environmental impacts of the plan related to a series of topics that are required under the California Environmental Quality Act. That resulted in the draft EIR. This is a very large, information-dense document. It was published in October 23rd, 2018. When that was released, it also went to state agencies for comment and also out to the public for a 71-day comment period from October 23rd to January 2nd. So we were required under CEQA to have at least 45 days. So this is almost double of that, just to give people some more time to have a look at that, including the busy time over the holidays. So we're in the midst of that now. This meeting is intended to be a part of that, to receive some comments, and those will go into the record. All comments received during this comment period will receive a response in the final EIR. The final EIR will also include any revisions that need to be made to the draft EIR based on comments that we've received, and also a list of all commenters and any additional information that it turns out we need to include. So that will be released sometime in the early spring. We'll need a little bit of time depending on how much the volume of response is. So that's really the driver there. After that, the final EIR will come back to you. It'll go before City Council for certification. And once that is certified, then you can consider adopting the EIR. Or sorry, not the EIR, the general plan. Okay. Just again, here's a list of the environmental topics covered under the EIR. So these are all required under CEQA Appendix G. There are a few that we're not really spending a lot of time on. So that's mineral resources and forestry. So those were scoped out earlier in the process. And then there's also a series of required conclusions that CEQA requires of us. So we have to state any significant environmental effects, any mitigation measures that are required to reduce those effects, significant irreversible environmental changes. So that's things that once they are done cannot be undone, growth-inducing impacts, cumulative impacts, so that's where a project may not be significant on its own, but in conjunction with other projects in the region, perhaps, could potentially produce an impact. And then also alternatives, so we're looking at, I think, one alternative to the plan. All right, so based on those, I encourage everyone to go take a look at the EIR. Tonight, we're focusing on the adequacy of the EIR, its information, and the analysis, not the merits of the general plan. Any public comments on those, if you're not ready to make them tonight, we're accepting them in writing through the city up until January 2nd, 2019, and then we'll include any responses to those in the final EIR. All right, so with that, we'll see if there's any public comment.
Well, before we go to public comments, there are a few things I would like to say by way of introduction. First, I do want to take this occasion to welcome our newest planning commissioner, Dan Hale. Dan, we're very happy that you're here. It was a long time, it seems, with only 4 members of the commission, so thanks for stepping forward. We're looking forward to working with you. Second, and maybe the comparison is not entirely apt. Nevertheless, I'm recalling the process by which the 1993 general plan was adopted, and I was on the city council then, and I think at our city council public hearings, we could have filled this room 4 or 5 times over. We filled the elementary school auditorium on several occasions before reaching a final decision on that. This room, as those of us who are present can see, I don't know if that's clear on the video feed, is pretty nearly empty. And I find that troubling. I don't know why we don't have more public participation this evening. Not sure that it's useful to speculate, but I will anyway. There are a number of possibilities. One, everyone has already reviewed it and they think it's so wonderful they really don't have anything to say. I think that's the least likely possibility. Another is that this process has gone on so long that everyone is more or less tired of it. That could be true for many. I note, and it's kind of sad to see, frankly, but when I go, for example, to the list of General Plan Update Initiation Committee members, these are people I think who would have been involved in 2007 when the process started. There are 13 names listed. At least 3 are the names of people no longer with us. Some are still alive but have moved out of town, and others are generally speaking at a stage in life where they no longer participate actively in civic affairs. In fact, it's kind of difficult to find anyone on that list other than 2 that I recognize having seen come forward to comment at any recent planning commission or city council meeting. I might have missed 1 or 2, but that to me is a kind of problematic measure of how long this process has gone on. So there's the possibility that we've just worn everyone out, maybe some even into their graves. Another possibility, and this is the one that distresses me the most, is that people might think that their comments don't make a difference. And I think I can safely speak for everyone present on this planning commission. Nothing could be further from the truth. We will all reach our own individual conclusions about the issues that are presented in the course of this general plan, EIR and general plan process, but all of your comments make a difference, whether we agree with you or not, and all of you have the potential to change our minds. So I hope that is not the reason. I'm looking at so many empty chairs. I am reminded of something that my fellow council member John Brown would say at all occasions like this, when we were at a city council meeting and we were facing an item on our agenda of obvious significance for the entire community. John would say to Marilee Talley, who in those days was the editor of the St. Helena Star, Marilee, would you please put something in the paper to remind people that we really want to hear from them? And then he'd tell the rest of us on the council we needed to continue the matter for another hearing. I'm not sure that that is necessary here, since we will be having additional hearings, but I'm not sure that we shouldn't either. We can talk about that later if anyone else on the commission is interested. But again, I not only value the comments of the public myself, I think it's really important for this process for the community to be engaged. So with all that said, I'll open the public hearing. Is there anyone who would like to speak?
Really excited because Commissioner Hale hasn't heard this before. My name is Vicki Bradshaw, and I'm a resident of St. Helena, and I think over the last 3 years, I have attended every single public hearing on the general plan. And over the last 2.5 years, this is at least the 10th time I've raised this issue, either in writing, in public testimony to the Planning Commission, or in public testimony to the City Council. And this is not my opinion, this is state law, and so far it has been ignored. Government Code Section 65302, lowercase g, 1, uppercase a, Roman numeral 8, requires a city with a housing element update after 2009. Ours was updated in 2015. And a city that has a flood wall and/or a levee has to show, quote, areas subject to inundation in the event of the failure of the project or non-project levee or flood wall, unquote, in the safety element of the general plan. This is a mandatory statutory requirement and not an elective option of a general plan. There is no such required inundation map in the current safety element of the 2040 general plan update issued at the end of October. At least 9 times prior to the issuance of that, we made public comments that that was required, and it's still not in there. The Governor's Office of Planning and Research, affectionately known as OPR, recently issued the General Plan Guideline Update and reconfirms that a levee and flood wall failure map is statutorily required. For the purposes of reference, you can find that confirmation on page 143 of the 404-page guideline document. There are a couple of reasons as to why it's important to have the map, the inundation map, in the general plan update. First, it's for safety reasons. Vineyard Valley, Hunts Grove, Meadow Creek Circle, and a lot of other areas in East St. Helena would be directly affected by a levee and/or flood wall failure. The residents there have a right to know what potential safety problems they may have. The flood wall and the levee are also located in areas of high and very high liquefaction regions, and liquefaction is a major and well-known cause for levee and flood wall failure. We already know we can have a significant earthquake, and had the 2014 earthquake in Napa had not happened during a drought, we very well could have had significant damage to our levee and flood wall due to liquefaction. And we don't even know for sure that we didn't have damage because we haven't checked. In the July 25th, 2016 public comments to the General Plan Update Draft Environmental Impact Report at that time was included a U.S. Geological Survey satellite map of Napa and St. Helena, which showed the significant ground movement in the area of the levee at the time of the earthquake. Basically saying that had there been rain, we would have had liquefaction in that area and potentially significant damage to our levee and flood wall. I assume those comments will be included in the environmental impact comments since the city never responded to those comments. The second reason to include the inundation map is for financial reasons. Many residents in Vineyard Valley and surrounding areas gave up their flood insurance when the levee and flood wall was completed, and they have a right to know the potential financial danger they may be in the event of a levee or flood wall failure because they no longer have insurance coverage. St. Helena also took out $12 million in loans and grants from the state of California in order to build the flood control project. As a result of this, the legislature passed and the governor signed Assembly Bill 1898, which was codified in the California Water Code at section 12,748.3, which states in part, quote, the state may provide funds in accordance with section 12,585.7 to the city of St. Helena or to local agencies in the county of Napa for the project for flood control on the Napa River in the county of Napa. It goes on to say, in close parentheses, lowercase c, a county or local agency may receive the funds only if it enters into an agreement with the department, and that would be the Department of Water Resources, pursuant to which the city or the local agency agrees to indemnify and hold in safe harmless the state, its officers, agents, and employees for any and all liability for damages that may result from the project. It continues at lowercase d. For the purposes of this section, liability for damages includes, but is not limited to, liability for damages relating to the construction or operation of the project or the failure of the project to operate as intended. Unquote. This basically means the city has indemnified the state in the event of a levee failure or flood wall failure, so the financial responsibility is entirely the city's, all of ours. Unless we can find somebody else to take the financial responsibility or to take the blame, and I think at this point that would be a little bit tricky. Every resident should know what the potential damages there might be, and thus what potential financial liability the city may have as a result of it. The inclusion of the required inundation map in the general plan update should also include a change to the environmental impact report so as to include what safety problems might exist and what potential environmental damage might be created when considering the intersection of the levee and flood wall inundation map, the liquefaction map, and the earthquake map, which are already included in the general plan update. The EIR should also include comments as to the safety and environmental impacts in the event of a levee and/or flood wall failure if there is housing and asphalt built behind the levee, since this area is now designated as medium-density residential. This could significantly impact the safety of residents, the financial responsibility of the city, and the impact to the environment because the current unobstructed floodplain would be negatively impacted. Because of the time it has taken to get the city to include the required general map in the general plan update, when it is finally included, it should be considered a substantive change and trigger a new public comment period. It would be unfair to insert such a map in the environmental impact comments after the close of the public comments on January 2nd and not allow the public to make comments as to the source and adequacy of the map and the EIR comments regarding it. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. I'm not seeing too many possibilities, but in the ordinary manner of things, I will ask if there's anyone else who would like to speak. Seeing none, I will close the public hearing. The public hearing is closed, so let's go back to the consultant then. Do we have any additional input or responses to the public comment?
No, not at this time. We'll be responding to everything as part of the final EIR in writing. All right. So just one more thing. We'll talk about next steps. The public review period ends Friday, January 2nd, 2019. Hoping to receive everything by the end of the business day at 5 p.m. So if anyone would like to make additional comments or if you know anybody who might be interested, I would urge you to let them know that this is the window for them to comment. So the final EIR, we're looking to have that together again by the end of the winter. And then look forward to certification hearings after that. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, no, this would be the time for questions of the consultant, and you know, we should, I think, start there so she knows when she's free to sit down, and then we can ask our planning director any questions we might have of staff.
You don't have any comment on the inclusion of that map?
So I don't know if I want to respond to that right now because of the process has us responding to them in writing as part of the final EIR. If I'll defer to Noah to see if there's anything that we want to address about that tonight.
Why isn't it there? I mean, that's my question.
So for the levy map, I believe it's just that we don't have access to that data. But we do have in the hydrology section a discussion about flooding hazards.
About what?
Flooding hazards? Mm-hmm.
So the
flooding and dam inundation hazards.
The safety element of the general plan includes a significant discussion of the flood project, risk associated with flooding, what it protects. Staff had reviewed this information and has been discussing how to respond with the city attorney and the consultant. There is a map in the safety element of the general plan. I think Ms. Bradshaw's comments are well taken, and staff will ensure that the final document meets all requirements of the law. And if it is determined that it is a significant increase or change in information, we will recommend that it be recirculated for another comment period.
I guess I don't understand. It's been, it's been brought up so long ago. How come it hasn't been clarified? I'm not a lawyer, but it sounds like it's required. So I don't understand why it's still a question. Or, maybe.
Well, forgive me if this sounds rude, but given that we know that Ms. Bradshaw has raised this comment many times, and we know that it is not yet reflected in the document, why would we need to know more than that for our purposes moving forward?
I'm just curious that why it hasn't been addressed. I mean, why it's not there, because it sounds so, I mean, there's probably a reason. I just was asking the reason because it doesn't make sense to me when it seems so clear in the statutes that were read or whatever they were. And there's been some, it's not like it's new information tonight. I just don't understand. I mean, I'll stop if you think it's inappropriate for me to try to understand that right now, but that's the motivation for my asking the question. If you could explain to me why it's not, and maybe you don't know, but I really am curious why it's not there in there, if it's so clearly stated as something that's required. No comment. Hey.
Do you mind if I not let our planning director or consultant, who both I think are doing a fantastic job, it's no surprise that maybe occasional lapses or things don't get included that should be included. And this is the perfect time to bring it up. And I am extremely happy, Ms. Monette, that you're also concerned about this. I'm grateful to our public today for being concerned about this, but we have to attribute positive intention, I think, to all of us in terms of our desire to get the EIR correct and have a good general plan that we all can be supportive of as a community. So,
right, and I don't mean to be attacking anyone. I just would like to know what your reasoning is.
we may not be able to uncover reasoning. You may be asking I almost want to say, epistemological question. There is no answer. And that's okay. We just have to be okay with that. But now that we know,
if that's what they tell me.
if we know potential gaps, our city attorney isn't here. I don't want to limit discussion.
I'll just say staff wasn't ready to respond with an explicit answer that I think is what you're looking for, rightly so. However, I will say there may be a variety or a range of opinion as to how that government statute is met. And one person's opinion, it may be different than another's. And so, again, staff will work with the city attorney's office and the consultant to ensure that the document meets the legal requirements. If more information needs to be added to what's currently in the documents, we will absolutely do so. But we will ensure that the government code section that was referenced and the information that's required by that mandate will be provided if it is not currently in the document.
Will we be notified if that change is made, or would that just come up at another hearing? I'm not sure how that would work.
Well, the final EIR must have responses to all comments that are submitted during the comment period. So at a minimum, we can expect to see a response to the comment in the final EIR.
Yeah, so let me just kind of reiterate the process. So staff receives all the comments, both the ones that came in today, there was one comment previously submitted in writing from a responsible agency from the state, and then all the comments that are received as of January 2nd. Responses to those comments are incorporated into so the comments themselves, in addition to responses to them, are incorporated in the document. Sometimes those responses result in changes to the EIR, which are highlighted and communicated. Oftentimes they do not. So it's just a response as to how the comment has been addressed in the current amount of information that's provided is provided in the document, but comments don't always result in the need to change the analysis.
Well, if I can ask just one more, just in case, let's assume that the changes that have just been talked about tonight were implemented, and it was considered significant change, so that the comment period would be extended. Would we hear about? How would we hear about that, or would we hear about that before January 2nd, or how would?
No, it would not happen before January 2nd.
Okay, all right.
And it wouldn't be an extension of the comment period, as Ms. Bradshaw was discussing. It would be a new circulation of the amended document and a whole new comment period.
That's correct. The document is somewhat
That's why
seen.
the significance of the changes are relevant. They're relevant to whether or not recirculation is triggered.
This is so great. I have a question for the consultant. I appreciate the effort on the EIR and, in general, your work on the general plan update. As I circulate among the community, as I've been wandering around town, I hear less understanding of why they should participate at this level, that the general plan may already be baked. Can you address that at all in this hearing, that comments will get responses, whether they're to the EIR or to the general plan directly, and perhaps the Fourth Estate could, they get to make their own decision about what's news, but I think it's significant, and we've got a month, and I'd love to get some comments from folks.
Sure. So I think first we can point to the fact that this process has been ongoing for a period of time, and that is partially due to the interest of the community or interest of decision makers in incorporating feedback that they've been receiving from the community over the years. Typically, when we do this process, assuming that everything goes well, that the EIR is adequate, it's acceptable, it can be certified, and that the plan is generally also acceptable to decision makers based on things that they've heard from the community. The hearings tend to be a good place for any additional feedback. It isn't necessarily the end of the road when you get to a public hearing at that stage. It's just all part of the process where Planning Commission and then also City Council in their own meeting will take the information that comes in from the EIR and any additional public comments on the plan that's been received up until that point, and they'll decide whether or not to move forward with those final documents or if any additional work or any additional outreach is needed. So I believe that has already happened, at least back in 2012 for this project. Ideally, we're at pretty close now where that wouldn't be a very significant extension or a need to do that again at this stage. But the only way we really know that is if the public does participate. And so one of the things about the final EIR, the draft EIR is a draft. It's a thick document. It's got a lot of research in it, but it is a draft. And so what a draft means is that we need people to review and say, this is correct. This may not be accurate. This is confusing. Things like that come back to us in terms of the public comment, and we are required by law to respond to everything. Even if it's off topic, we'll state so. We won't necessarily cover it, but we have to look at it all. And not only do we have to look at it, but it does get published. It goes back to decision makers as part of their information as they review the project itself. And so it's all part of the public record, and it's all part of that information. And the whole point of certifying the EIR, what the city council would be saying when they certify, is we have read this, we understand the implications, and we are willing to move forward with it. Or they can say it needs additional work. Or we can certify it, we understand it, we believe it's adequate, and we're still not going to adopt the plan. So these things, it's all within the realm of possibility, but the only way that we can really weigh those options is if the more information that we get from people and the more interaction that we get, the better the end products end up being.
Thank you. That was super helpful, and thank you for explaining that. And then as a side comment, all citizens of St. Helena are on topic. So, all right. That's all. Thanks.
Ms. Bradshaw, did you have something you would like to say? As I'm happy to reopen the hearing. There's not much competition for the microphone.
A little bit of clarification.
That's fine.
Noah mentioned that they were trying to determine what was the best way to accomplish. The best way to accomplish. She was a little shorter than I am, I guess. I didn't think that was possible. But in the same government code section, it requires that a city show areas protected by levee protection areas. That's a separate line than the areas subject to inundation in the event of a failure. There's also a requirement that if you have a dam, you have to have a dam failure inundation map. We do have a dam, and we do have a dam failure inundation map. So I think it would, if we have levees and that requires areas subject to inundation, we have to have a separate chart or description showing where are the areas of inundation in the event of a failure. And one of the reasons they require that is an area, when a levee fails, the water is much more forceful and can create much more damage than if it's just normal flooding. So that's why they have a separate inundation map requirement. Thank you.
Thank you. And oh, sure. I'll close the public hearing. It's rarely felt so much like a mere formality. I'm not sure that your question, the part about EIR and general plan responses was clearly answered. Maybe it was, but I'll give you mine.
I feel like it was, but
The consultant's responsibility is to respond to comments on the EIR. As a practical matter, it's our responsibility on the commission to respond as we choose to comments on the general plan itself.
But this is the moment. If there's a final moment, both
No,
for the
this is
EIR.
not- for the EIR,
Yes.
but not for the general plan.
Yeah.
And final yes and no. This is the only hearing on our calendar before the comment period closes. But that doesn't mean that comments at subsequent meetings on the environmental document go into some kind of black hole. They don't. They're still there, they're part of the record, and everyone has to make appropriate decisions about their significance.
Up to the minute you adopt the EIR.
Until the last gavel sounds at the last public hearing. I mean, honestly, I would say to people who really care about this, and Ms. Bradshaw may be an example of an unusual degree of diligence in this regard, but it's pretty much the case that one should, if one cares, comment early and comment often. That is how one makes a difference. It's a fatiguing enterprise, but that is how one makes a difference. And if, yeah, I mean, that's it. That's what it's about. So are there any other comments from the commission?
Yes.
Please.
I have several. Let me start off by asking the consultant present, is your expertise in a particular subgenre in here, or are you a generalist? So in other words, if I ask something, can I get a partial answer, or am I going to go Zoom? I mean, what are we talking about here?
Well, I guess the only way to really know is to know what your question is. I'm mainly a generalist. My focus is more on the environment. So,
okay.
is
Let me
general things about
get
the
going
environment.
then. Most of these will be on the mitigation measures in the plan itself. And I'm going to start off with AQ2, which, if I can quote from it, it's on page 3.3-43. And I read the whole thing cover to cover, so excuse me if this may take a while. Require that applicants proposing development of projects within the city of St. Helena, yada, 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 all project applicants shall submit evidence of the use of low VOC coatings to BAA QMD prior to the start of construction.
Where it is? You went really
It's
fast.
on
I don't-
3.3-43. It's AQ2. And my only concern here is that, is there some state law or
Okay,
air
this-
district requirement that submittal go to them?
Oh, fuck. I put the wrong one in.
To be AAQMD, you mean?
Yes.
So the mitigation measure for this, I'm not exactly sure how it was formulated, but typically this would come from some sort of recommendation that.
The problem I see on this, everybody putting up a new house is going to send this submittal to the BAA QMD. And it's simply, by reading it, a checkoff. Yes, I am using low VOC materials. Unless there's some statutory requirement, I prefer that stop at the city. As part of their building application, yes, we are using low VOC materials. End of story. That's.
So your question is a regulatory question.
Yes, yes. There's always like it's. I see no reason to layer on to some poor sucker building a house yet another application requirement, and this time to the BAA QMD.
So the Air Board is responsible. They're the responsible agency managing air quality for City of St. Helena. So I think that's the intent of why the information is being provided to them as a responsible agency, given that we have no regulatory authority to address air quality impacts here in St. Helena.
Correct, but you do have regulatory authority to control the materials they put on their house. So in other words, if you say, we agree with the state, no more lead paint, your rules carry as much weight as theirs.
We implement their direction, correct?
Correct. And I would think in this case, rather than sending a note to the BAA QMD that may be an application that may be another $500, that may take another 6 weeks for the BAA QMD to process and say, yes, you're using low VOC materials. Just as a short stop, I would prefer that be done locally, if at all possible. It just kind of makes sense to me rather than carry it over. AQ3, require all development applications with the potential to create point source air quality. That's going to be a very small number, I would assume. That's just sort of a question. It's like dry cleaners, gas stations. Okay, so it's almost going to disappear. However, AQ6 on page 51 of the same section, basically, if I can read this one again, all applicants proposing development projects within 1,000 feet of existing sensitive receptors as defined by the BAA QMD, which includes all residences, right? Have to do a health risk assessment. My only question on this one, is this, once again, statutory?
That's a state mandate.
Okay, because that means every building project in the city would have to do a health risk assessment. Everybody's within 1,000 feet of something. A residence, a school, a shopping center, a retirement home, and all those. So that's all projects within the city, anywhere, everywhere.
Which mitigation measure are you referencing?
AQ6.
AQ6. It literally says all applicants proposing development projects within 1,000 feet of sensitive receptors. So if that's statutory, that's statutory. That means every project in the city, all the time, forever.
Really?
Yeah.
All?
Within 1,000 feet of a home?
Yes.
Within 1,000 feet of a school?
I understand the language is very specific. This is typically undertaken as a part of an initial study resulting in mitigated negative declaration.
Okay.
But we will look at that language.
As I,
So,
Can I-
and, you know, I'm looking at this sort of through a CEQA lens, if you will. Is that intended to mean all discretionary projects subject to environmental review? Or
That's
is it-
correct. Non-exempt projects, that's correct.
well, it should
But
really
the language
say
isn't written that way.
yeah.
That's right.
That's a huge problem.
Yes. If it's simply all projects requiring environmental review, that changes.
Yeah.
But right now it says all projects, period.
Why is it a huge project? Could you please explain that?
Because you don't do an environmental review on a single house.
Majority of our projects are
I see
exemptions.
what you're saying.
For example.
It's a huge project, it's a huge
Yeah.
problem to have it, yeah. okay.
Yeah.
Imagine what it would be like to be required to prepare a site-specific construction health risk assessment, taking into account both project level and cumulative health risks
For a new garage.
for a permit to rewire your bathroom. And it doesn't make sense.
And that's the way it's written, all projects.
And I do believe there actually is flexibility in the requirements from the Air Board for health risk assessments and the threshold, so we will review that language.
Okay, because I see this costing lots of money if every project was caught under that one. Page 3.6-43, mitigation GHG1. Adopt and implement a climate action plan with a goal of 18 months, but no later than 36 months. I recognize we're caught in a cleft stick here. That there are essentially no rules on this. There's a gap period. And the state hasn't adopted a set of standards. The state hasn't adopted implementation rules. We've got nothing. So why are we writing a plan that isn't going to do anything, that may not reach the targets the state has set, which haven't been set? So we'll be shooting completely in the dark. I'm trying to figure out, A, how this is a mitigation, and B, how do you assess the success of that mitigation, since the state has neither set targets nor goals, nor a way of reaching those targets and goals?
Wait, so when you say that the state hasn't set targets or goals, you mean outside of the carb scoping plan?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. So there.
The write-up here literally says, that are consistent with statewide reduction targets, but the state hasn't set how to get to those reduction targets, what measures are usable, what measures we have control over, what measures we have no control over. And it seems to me, really looking at this, that 90% of the control measures will be at the state and regional level anyway. We can't say in the city of St. Helena, nobody gets to drive anything but an electric car. That would be blatantly illegal. And looking at your assessment, one of the things we could do is cut out all transportation sources and come close to meeting the target. Still not even meet the target.
So just to clarify, city staff spent significant time with the consultant and the city attorney's office on this, and I had similar concerns. The governor signed an executive order mandated certain greenhouse gas levels be reached by 2030 and then 2050.
But no way to get there.
There is no roadmap on how we get there. So the climate action plan mitigation is intended to address that state mandate that's been directed to provide to us. However, there's been no roadmap identifying how individual jurisdictions will address that. But I will say there is language here which says sectors that the city has direct or indirect jurisdictional control over. And that is a critical element to this mitigation measure. Obviously, we can't control how many people drive in on the highway, but the climate action plan is intended to set both quantify the greenhouse gas productions in the city that we are resulting in, contributing to the overall carbon footprint of the state, and identify methodologies by which we can reduce that, addressing our per capita contribution to get to the state mandated levels.
The way this thing reads to me is we're supposed to write a plan to meet the state mandated levels.
Based on what's under our control.
We cannot meet the state mandated levels by using what's in our control. So that's how short the plan can be. We can't do it. You don't have the tools.
But every city and jurisdiction does their fair share based on their per capita emissions, then we would get there. And I think that's what this is intended to do. Again, significant conversations have occurred with the city attorney's office and the consultant. The city attorney's office agrees this is a mandated mitigation in order for us to have a legally defensible CEQA document.
So we need to write a plan that shows we can't reach the targets without huge, and I really mean huge, additional input from the state, the feds, and the regional agencies.
It will definitely involve the state and responsible agencies, federal government. I mean, they haven't committed to our 2050 thresholds.
As there's literally no way on God's green earth we can meet the target
We can
without huge changes.
Block the highway.
Block the highway.
Again,
Well, we had one mayor lay across the railroad tracks at one point. Would that be it? Never mind. Okay.
but I mean, staff understands the concern. I had similar concerns, but we need to write a legally defensible document, and we were somewhat painted into a corner by a
Okay.
executive order from the governor. So
Okay.
we're responding to that.
Reading this, it triggers the idea we're writing something that's not going to do us much good. Okay. On the transportation section, to start off with, impact 3.13-2 on page 49 of 313. The NVTA is not a CMA. Has not been a CMA for about 15 years. Hasn't been a congestion management agency. There's a section of code in the government code 65,088 at SEC that mandates establishments of congestion management agencies in counties that have an urban area over a certain size, but they can opt out. This county opted out 15 years ago. So we have no CMA, thus no CMP. So it should sort of be written like the airport section. We just don't have one. I realize you're not taking comments on the general plan itself, but I need to make one on 13-39 CR 3.3. Shift travel from single occupant vehicles to other modes so that by 2040, 45% of the work trips in St. Helena residents will be, and workers are by carpool, transit, walking, or bicycling. I would prefer that says attempt to shift or strive to shift because the scope of the shift without massive economic or social changes is not possible. Our walk to...
Excuse me, but where are you right now?
I'm at the top, CR 3.3 on page 39 of the transportation section.
3.13-39.
Yeah, you can...
Thank you.
Yeah. Our walk to work right now is about 4%. Our transit's less than 1. Bicycle is about 1. Having that grow by 10 times, so unlikely as to be almost laughable.
2040. Let's just, something like 50% a year for 20 years?
See? Okay.
Commissioner Pont, in your great detailed note, I just noticed an error. Can I make that brief comment on the error?
Be my guest.
Okay. On the figure 3.13-1, which shows the street and whether they're the streets in St. Helena in our lovely town, whether it's a regional connector, downtown mixed use, etc. Please note that the extension of Vallejo Street all the way to Sulphur Spring Avenue, you've used the incorrect, well, sorry, you didn't, but in some way this map is not similar to other maps of the city in that the very end of Vallejo Street is adjoined Sulphur Spring Avenue, has a jog, and that's a Google Maps mistake. It's actually pretty much straight. So, do you see that, planner, director, Hausch? Yeah, it's just right at the end.
What's the graphic? I'm looking at 3.13-2.
-1.
Street network.
-1.
13-1, 13-2.
Against the street, it's 3.13-5. It's right before that.
I believe Director House is very familiar with the end of Vallejo.
Yes, he is.
That's the comment is 3.13-1 should match 3.13-2 with regards to the circulation of Vallejo.
Okay.
Yeah, not just the circulation, but also the actual, how it's drawn.
Okay. My next set, I suppose, start on 13-44. Essentially, mitigation measures for, unfortunately, a significant and unavoidable about traffic operations. To start with, it calls for 2 new signals on Main Street. I know as part of this, your team looked into what happens to the string of signals as a whole if you go ahead and add this. My only problem with it is that you have at least one intersection that the delay is so high, it's just simply reported as above 120 seconds delay at the intersection, which means, at least to my understanding, that's the analysis edge of the particular software you're using. So in other words, beyond 120 seconds may mean 121 seconds. It may also mean 1,001 seconds. So without an exact knowledge of what the delay is, by modeling these intersections as a set, you're assuming the delay at that one intersection is 120 seconds, which it might be true. It might also be so much larger than that that you get a cascading set of failures. So I'm worried this analysis didn't look at delays of beyond 120 seconds, and thus by adding additional signals, which all take time from the main line, they just do that anyway, that we'll have a cascading series of failures.
I could be wrong, but that sounds to me as though it could be reframed as a question. Does this analysis assume
Yes.
nothing more than 120 seconds delay?
Yes.
And then
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I certainly appreciate the consultant's look at Grayson and 29 and saying, even though as an individual intersection, it looks like it'll pass, but the delay at Pope and Main is so long that it floods out Grayson and Main, ergo we've got problems there too. I'm worried about the delay at Pope and Main exceeding the limits of your calculation, and thus we have a cascade of failures. So these two intersection signalizations,
That occurs today.
yes.
And John also coming into town from the north, the Madrone Street, and
And I'm worried-
Adams.
And I'm worried putting a light at Main and Sulphur Springs and Main at Pratt, particularly to take the small movements at Main and Pratt. I know nobody likes to wait, but I checked your analysis in the appendices, and it was approximately 80 cars in the peak hour at Pratt for 15 or 1,600 on Main Street. So there's a trade there. You're allowing the 90 cars to move now, but you're stopping 1,500. And if by stopping that 1,500, you begin to roll that cascade failure problem, it puts a whole different light on what you're doing and why you're doing, and whether or not this is a mitigation measure or whether or not it actually makes it worse. Okay, if that makes any sense to you. By the way, my expertise is in transportation.
No one would have guessed.
I just wanted her to know.
And I will just state the obvious, and I appreciate the comment very much, because I think it's, I'm not trying to cut you off. I think it's critical that we identify areas where, if the analysis is incomplete or otherwise not quite right, a mitigation measure could become the opposite, which is its own potentially significant adverse impact.
Like I said, the consultants recognize the cascade failure taking place at Grayson and Main. I'm just wondering if by adding these two additional signals, we're now increasing it. TR3, I read this as a must-do, right? The city must do one of these extensions, one of these sets of extensions. You've got them in it as either or. Part of the question circulates around the alternative, the one where you're extending Oak Street. Well, now as part of the mitigation for the approved, for the preferred alternative, it looks like you're also doing road extensions. This looks like to me it's written as a must.
It specifically defers approval to the city council.
But if they don't do it, then of course they're not carrying out one of the mitigation measures in their EIR.
EIR has to propose, if a mitigation measure is available to address a significant environmental impact, the EIR is required to propose mitigation to address it.
And it does, but it's written as a must. So I don't know if that's.
What do you want it to say? Possible, or, you know?
Well, I mean, you've got an alternative where you look at extending Oak Street, which is on the west side, right? For free-flowing traffic, and frankly, for emergency access, as far as I could tell. Now, in this package, as part of the preferred alternative, you're making extensions on the east side of 29 for circulation, safety, and access. So we're approving, as part of this environmental document, a mitigation that says you need to do extensions on the east side.
That's not how staff reads it, or it's intended to
Is
be
that a
read, so.
Question,
If
Or-
what is it, in jeopardy, the answers must be in the form of, never mind.
Yeah, so when mitigation measures are written, they have to be, for us to say this would definitely reduce the impact, they have to be written in a very defined way. So within the mitigation measure, we wouldn't say, potentially do this or consider doing this, because if all you do is consider doing it, it may not actually include the action that would reduce the impact. What I would say is the way that the impact statements are written, so significant and unavoidable versus less than significant with mitigation. If it's clear that without the mitigation measure that the impact would still be significant, it is an option for the city to say we would like to move forward with this, knowing that without the mitigation, we would not be reducing the impact to less than significant.
Okay, so this is significant and unavoidable with it. It's significant and unavoidable without it. Ergo, Okay.
Can I ask a question just associated with that? What if the mitigation measure that you have would reduce the significant impact of the issue that you're trying to reduce, but would create another impact that is significant that didn't even exist before, before your mitigation to fix number one? So there would be because I'm thinking of the neighborhoods on the east side. I mean, yeah, maybe you'd reduce the traffic and that'd be a significant positive impact, but we create a different significant impact. How do you consider that when you're writing these mitigation plans, whatever?
So ideally, that's something that would come up in the discussion as we're drafting it. If it's something that makes it through into the draft document, that's where we receive comments from state agencies who may have a sense of, so for example, things having to do with Caltrans. A lot of times they will respond and point out specific difficulties with certain mitigation measures if that's something that is sort of within their purview. But this is one of the areas where we do rely on public comment and discussion during
for the unintended negative consequences of a particular mitigation that in a completely different area. What I'm saying is write it down and send it to you. I mean, what I'm hearing.
Oh yeah, yes. Because what we're looking at is the project as it's written, which is the draft general plan. So any mitigation measure like that's coming from outside of the project. So we wouldn't necessarily be in the EIR assessing impacts of mitigation measures. Typically, if there's something that would be sort of obviously a problem, that it wouldn't be suggested as a mitigation measure, or it would be suggested and in like the statement of overriding considerations, we'd note this is not really feasible. But
so if you got some comments to that effect, you would. Okay, thank you.
Just a couple more. On TR5, signalization of Silverado Trail at Pope Street. And this is kind of an aside, but I don't think there's any way functionally to do that without replacing the operationally deficient bridge. I really don't. I don't think you can. I don't think you can design a working signalized intersection there without replacing the bridge.
I wish I had. I'm sure I could find it. The 1996 proposal, which would have preserved the existing bridge as a pedestrian walkway,
right,
and constructed a new bridge and then realigned the intersection so that you had Pope Street opposite Howell Mountain Road, and then instead of contemplating two signals, if you thought signalization were necessary, you would have one because you'd have the intersections aligned.
Yeah.
And that's a proposal that went all the way to council level, so I'm thinking.
And they accepted the environmental document, but didn't move forward on the project.
Right. No,
Which-
Bill Savage used to say that was the worst decision he ever made, voting no on that.
Which generated some problems with their federal funding source for the environmental document.
Yeah, I can imagine. Maybe you and I can look at that at some point.
Okay.
Is
One
that-
more thing, and this is,
I'm sorry, Commissioner Pont, is the concern that the EIR is asking for something
Well-
in that regard?
it's saying signalize the intersection. I don't think you can signalize that intersection without replacing the bridge. Because the bridge approach is narrow and inadequate.
Yeah, it's substandard.
It's what's called in the lingo functionally deficient.
Yeah, I agree.
So are you just saying that it should say that specifically, or it shouldn't be said at all until, I'm not sure.
The problem is now that you're talking about replacing a bridge as part of an intersection, you've now opened a much larger kettle of fish, as it were.
I mean, in terms of the EIR, you think they should mention that that's the case?
No. But just, like I said, this is more or less an
I
aside.
thought you were saying that's an infeasible mitigation measure in effect.
In effect, yeah, without replacing the bridge. So.
They added the part about replacing the bridge, and then you would think it would be a reasonable mitigation.
Well, in that case, there should be some, in the interest of having the document be not internally inconsistent,
Well, it does
that
say
should be mentioned.
It doesn't leave out replacing the bridge. It just says signalize the intersection, right? Which, like I say, as an aside, I think would require the replacement of the bridge.
So why not a subclause that says which may require the replacement or reconfiguration of the bridge?
Is that
Possibly.
what you're asking for?
I don't know if that
whoops.
opens
Director
up-
Hausch is
if that
shaking his head
opens
at
up
me.
the environmental document, but
Oops.
you do have, I believe, an accepted environmental document on replacing the bridge. It's too old, but nonetheless.
So the comment is noted and understood. However, the mitigation measure is addressing circulation and not the existing functionality of the Pope Street Bridge.
The famous comment noted.
Excuse me. How can the circulation element address circulation and not take into account the functionality at that intersection?
It absolutely does take into account the functionality of the intersection, and the recommendation is to improve the functionality through signalization.
Um, 13-5 on 13-51. Implementation of the proposed plan had not resulted in inadequate emergency access. We're not putting through streets on either the west or the east side of 29. We admit that 29 is basically so clogged as to be impassable. We have put a satellite fire station out at one end of town simply because of how it works now. Jump to 2040, when we have much, much worse operations. And once again, no through streets. I have trouble seeing how this doesn't affect emergency access, not just for fire, but for police, for ambulance, for anybody and everybody. Even to the point that say, okay, we're going to put in overrides on all the signals on 29. I don't know if that would work, particularly through the core part of town where you have parking You have a lane, and then you have a turn lane and another lane and parking. There is no way to drive around it or through it.
Get rid of the wine train, turn that into an emergency access road.
Well, that's not going to get you across the Silverado Trail at Pope Street during the PM peak.
Well, you can go down to Deer Park. Right.
That's
So
right. And that goes exactly to the point. I don't see how one can, with a straight face, honestly, say that we have adequate emergency access if our emergency service vehicles have to go down to Deer Park in order to get to a location within the city limits on the other side of the Silverado
I'm
Well,
Trail.
to
just
my
not
mind,
sure that
given
we
the-
don't have another,
Given the
another significant and unavoidable, frankly.
no matter what the cross streets are between Silverado Trail and Highway 29, and in the event of a real crisis, both of those highways would be clogged up. There is not significant, it's a very dangerous situation, and it's pretty
I'm not talking
intractable.
about the north-south
No, I'm
part of
talking
it.
about cutting
I'm talking
across.
about east-west.
I know it, but having an east-west access to the trail and Highway 29, if both of those roads are going to be clogged, and those northwest connectors are not going to ease the emergency issue.
I'm not even speaking to that.
Oh, I thought that's what you.
Commissioner Bont-
I'm just
Yes.
saying we don't have adequate emergency access as is,
And
and
I'm
I
just
don't
saying it's
see how this
impossible.
circulation element provides us with adequate emergency access. So I'm with John. Without knowing more from the consultants who prepared this, I'm inclined to think that what we really have is a significant but unavoidable.
Yeah, and this is a
Yes.
question. I mean, I've got concerns about this. I'm not jumping up and saying this is automatically. It's through this analysis that says we're going to be terribly clogged. The analysis indicates that. The analysis indicates that 29 is going to operate at basically level of service F, right? We have sections of town you can't reach unless you use 29 as the access, because there's no through roads on the east side or the west side, depending on what section of town you're talking about, where you're talking about. For those sections of town, in fact, considering how badly 29 is going to be clogged, anything south of the bridge versus anything north of the bridge, we got a problem. And someone can say, no, this is not significant and unavoidable, and here's why. But right now, I don't see that in here.
I agree with you.
Particularly since you have as a mitigation measure extensions on the east side.
Which section are you talking about?
This is 313-5, and you're proposing extensions on the east side in TR3 for 313.-1, which you say is significant and unavoidable, but yet you're recommending extensions basically on the east side of town. Here you're not recommending any extensions on the east side of town. And you're saying, we're cool. It's not going to be a problem. I see a disconnect there, and I see a problem between the two, given the analysis shows that we're going to have, the main roads are going to be clogged.
It's unavoidable. I don't know how it would be avoided.
That's why I see a disconnect.
By
between those
2040,
two.
there's supposed to be 4 million more people in the Bay Area. That's the last I read.
So, Commissioner Pont, you've raised a question. What do you think a possible?
For this one,
Yes.
I think, A, it's significant but unavoidable. If I was just reading what I have been reading without any further input from the consultants, I'd say it's significant and unavoidable. And your mitigation measures, once again, are the same set of mitigation measures, maybe, I'm not talking about the cascade failure again, for TR3, which is the extensions on the east side of town.
I'm sorry, which impact is significant and unavoidable?
313-44.
3.13-5.
Extension, mitigation measure TR-3 are those set of extensions on the
Sure.
east side of town.
Yeah.
Right.
Which impact is it that you're saying is significant and unavoidable that's not identified as such? That's what I'm,
Inadequate emergency access
on which page?
on 3.13-51.
Thank you.
Because the analysis for the previous section indicates that we've got failed roads. We're still going to have failed roads. They're still going to be operationally deficient, even with these improvement measures. Right? But you're saying the same set of operationally deficient roads are okay for emergency access. Hard sell. Real hard sell.
You know, that's my flunks the straight face test. His hard sell is my fails the straight face test.
So if the transportation consultant can get up here and say, this is why it's going to work for emergency access, even though it doesn't work the rest of the time. Okay,
I don't think that's going to happen, so
it could. I've had traffic engineers tell me all kinds of things.
well, that's worth like the paper it's written on then. I mean,
What I'm hearing from Commissioner Pond is that we need to take another look at this impact and provide a little bit more justification as to how the conclusion was come to with regards to the significance, and potentially that significance could change.
Yeah, it could go away, but right now I've got a question on those two not lining up real well. And that's it, I think, for substantive questions. I've got a whole bunch of other things about spelling and maps missing street names and that kind of stuff, but I'll send that 100 or so to you separately.
Great. Yeah, so we'll,
If I read
yeah.
the planning area of the proposed plan one more time, no.
Thank you for doing such a thorough analysis.
You're spoiling us, John.
Never mind.
Can you give me the number of the thing that that you're going to take a closer look at?
It's impact 3.13-5. And the finding is that the implementation of the proposed plan, which is essentially the general plan through 2040, would not result in inadequate emergency access.
Okay.
And that's found to be less than significant.
Is that the page number?
Oh, page is 3.13-51.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other commissioner comments?
yeah, but I think it's just me spitting in the wind here. I mean, we're so stuck on the number of bridges that we have over Sulphur Spring Creek. I mean, and we're what's that?
Creek or the river?
First the creek, then the river. We've got two pinch points, north-south and east-west.
Is Pratt actually in town? The bridge at Pratt? Does the city boundary run down the middle of the river, or does it run down one side?
No, it's,
If it runs down the middle, we own half the bridge, half's in the county.
It's my understanding that
If-
the county is responsible for maintaining the bridge.
Then it's probably their bridge, or at least half of it. So,
yeah, it looks like the city, at that point, the
I
city border is at the middle of the river.
I can't tell because the registration on the maps seems to be a little bit off.
Yeah. But I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, we simply don't have the connectors north-south, and we don't have the connectors east-west in an emergency. In other ways, it sort of preserved our town.
Yeah.
But from an emergency perspective, yuck.
You know-
Particularly if there was an earthquake or flooding or a mass evacuation from the hills to the east, for example. I mean, it'd be a mess. And we've seen how difficult, just in the fires, and now this latest fires over in Butte County.
Yes, and growing traffic problems and emergency access is pretty much a problem all over the state. Every urban area has this problem.
And, I mean, maybe there's part of this is sort of not a shrugging of the shoulders, but simply allowing the citizens to understand the risks that they're facing. Because the mitigation measures may be too significant for us to undertake.
Yeah, I'm wondering, when you're making these mitigation measures, for instance, if the mitigation measures were to open up through the east side of the town connectors, but in so doing, you would go against the general plan goal of preserving neighborhoods. How do you balance that? How do you look at that? Do you look at the?
Well, we wouldn't be the ones to balance that. That's the decision makers for the city. Yeah.
So that has to come in also in a comment.
CEQA is looking purely at the environmental impacts.
Okay.
And then that's been one of the constraints that the consultant has faced, given that we have a policy that says we may not be interested in addressing some of these circulation impacts through roadway extensions.
Well, that is an environmental impact to impact the neighborhood.
But not necessarily under CEQA.
Oh, okay. So
But that's the issue is while a road extension, from a current cul-de-sac, for example, to becoming a connector street, obviously does create change and impacts to the neighborhood that may not be seen as an environmental impact under CEQA. So that's the
there has to be
distinction.
consistency between the EIR and the general plan. So I mean, you have to look at, maybe it's not a CEQA law, but it's in the general plan of the city.
Well, and this is why you can have general plan policies which impact the ability to mitigate environmental impacts, which is essentially what we've been running up against with this discussion.
Okay.
And I think our current planning recognizes that, Bobby, by saying these extensions on the east side, without special council approval and findings, can only be for bicycle, pedestrian, and emergency vehicles. So I think they've already recognized that. And they've already also recognized the emergency access problem by making these allowable for emergency vehicles.
And it is worth noting that two of the roadway extensions are identified as new bridges. But those are potential if they are given support by the decision makers. And that's why this document is having trouble. It's a struggle to say this will occur, and so therefore the environmental impact of the circulation will be addressed, because it's uncertain whether those road extensions will be done. So the document is struggling with that. But the extension of Adams and the extension of Mills are both identified.
Or the extension of Oak, or, I mean, it's just littered throughout the extension of Star. I mean, that doesn't include a bridge, but I mean, there's multiple places that the lack of ability to circulate in an emergency could lead to circumstances that none of us really want to contemplate.
That's correct. And it's worth noting the 93 general plan shows all of these as to be extended. So this plan walks that back at the direction of the policies that were created through the update process.
And if you look at even older, Fulton was considered extend Fulton. I mean, there was been multiple places that the earlier city fathers and mothers were interested in connecting our fair city to north, south, east, and west corridors. It's a conundrum.
Well,
it really is.
I think, that the fires we had a year ago and the fires that have happened both north of us and south of us clearly indicate that if you have to do emergency types of evacuations, nobody's got a roadway system constructed to handle that load. Nobody. We just won't. They didn't.
Well, then that points to the fact that we need to enhance our own plans for, if necessary, fighting in place, you know? I want to say, I often don't pronounce things that I read, and I actually use wrong references, but what is the Maginot Line, Chair Hardy? Is there a line somewhere in France where they...
The Maginot Line? Yeah.
Microphone.
The Maginot Line was a set of conventional concrete and earthwork defenses constructed between the First World War and the Second World War that were intended to prevent an invasion of France directly from Germany.
Right.
And the Germans looked at that and said,
Who
"Stupid
cares?"
French, they forgot about Belgium and they went around it.
Well, so we need to have a better Maginot Line. But I was thinking of the correct reference for all of those that watch this on video, to protect our town in the event of a natural disaster, and to protect the lives and livelihood of those who are here.
Can I get one of the cool post-World War I, pre-World War II French helmets? No, never mind.
Personally, I think it's a natural disaster that we have the surge in population and traffic here in the first place. I mean, that's a disaster. Is the population in this area in terms of housing, in terms of traffic.
But I think that kind of situation and that kind of evacuation is not only beyond the scope of our general plan, it's beyond the scope of this environmental document. It's something we potentially need to worry about, but not here.
Yeah, I mean, when I was talking about sort of whether or not we have the correct conclusion on that particular section, I wasn't imagining fire or flood. I was imagining someone needs an ambulance at Howell Mountain Road at 5:15 on a Friday afternoon.
Right, or somebody in the industrial district has
A
just had
siren
an
won't get you
industrial
across the
accident.
Pope Street Bridge.
Needs an ambulance.
I mean, that's it. That's gridlocked at that time of day. You cannot get across it, and our emergency service providers won't go there for just that reason. They will go to Deer Park, and that adds time, and that can be a matter of life and death, literally.
Oh, you're talking about higher probability events that occur all the time that are sort of lower risk. And those are appropriate for our EIR to investigate. But I think also as a town, we need to think about bigger risks as well. And this may not be the place to do it, but...
And I would say that we're on the cusp of being forced to consider these larger scale events. The CPUC has dropped one shoe with their fire hazard maps. As soon as a state fire marshal drops his shoe or her shoe with their fire hazard maps, I think we do have those concerns come to the forefront in the community.
My concern is when there is no emergency, we have these road connectors that have been made through neighborhoods for the purpose of being able to be used in emergencies, and they will, in between emergency times, simply be used for, as thoroughfare, as local fairways to avoid Highway 29, so that the neighborhoods will then be inundated with traffic. So there's an ongoing consequence that is somewhat of a disaster to people living in the neighborhoods when there is no real disaster going on.
That drive around has gotten to be somewhat noticeable in certain parts of town.
Yeah, Allison, for example.
But I would be adamant in insisting if you sat on a corner of one of these drive-around routes and looked at everybody going past, you would be able to put names on 99% of them, because those driving past are us.
That's what I'm saying, exactly. Yeah.
You know, it's not visitors, it's not people driving, it's not the XX trips, if I can use a term of art, people starting from outside of town and going to outside of town.
That's what I'm talking about.
It's us.
I know, the enemy
So-
is, no, that's what I'm talking about, that, you know, these things are, these road, you know, these thoroughfare, you know, these extensions are necessary for in these crisis situations, but between crises, they make it their own crises. So.
And Commissioner Monette, the other fascinating thing about this, which I love about the plan and the EIR aspect, also from a transportation perspective, is it does talk about other ways to transit around the city, and support for bicycle paths and other bicycle designation. And you raise a really interesting point about locals using the roadways to do their business, and I hope we get to a place where we can start to encourage more alternative transportation modes.
Well, a lot of, I agree with you, and I appreciate that. A lot of these people are commuters, and they're coming home, and they're, at certain times, and I don't blame them. I mean, that's what will happen. That's a caveat when thinking of ways to solve the other issues. So that's all.
So we haven't heard from at least one commissioner, and so I just wanted to allow everyone to provide any comments on the EIR. The consultant, obviously will be taking these comments and any other comments that come in by January 2nd. Under deep consideration, we will be providing written responses to them and making changes to the EIR if needed. If those changes are significant, we will recirculate the EIR for another comment period. I was reviewing some of the state law referenced. There seems to be a couple elements that maybe have been blended together, that may be intentionally separated under the statute, but we're going to take a look at it. We'll get the city attorney's office involved and provide an adequate response to all comments we receive.
Where do we send our comments? Can you say that for everyone?
Yes, please. So all written comments shall be sent to me directly, either at Noah Hausch, Planning Director, either at 1480 Main Street, if you'd like to use snail mail, or you can send them to my email at nhoush@cityofsthelena.org. Saint is just ST. It's all lowercase, and there is no period. My contact information is available on the website. I can also provide it to anyone who wants to come in and chat with me directly.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excuse me. Moving on to the next item on our agenda, we have no scheduled matters. Do we have any department reports?
Nothing to report. We will say, so staff has struggled to replace our consultant planner, so applicants who are filing applications are finding that we are not necessarily meeting some of our timelines as we'd like to. We just have a lot of work going on right now, 27 active planning projects, a number of ordinances that we just wrapped up, trying to implement those ordinances, and then managing 2 EIRs on top of all the other things that we've been addressing. And so we are slipping a little bit. If you all are hearing some complaints about that, that is a fact. We're doing our best. We're trying to figure out how to come up with some staffing solutions. Working with the city manager on that, and we hope to have some ideas shortly, or at least some fruitful reactions to our ideas shortly. But other than that, the department, we had a great turnout on some of the recreation activities that have been occurring. I think the Jingle All the Way is being very appreciated, and I do believe we will be having our first pop-up retailer opening up in downtown next week. So we are trying to get some traction on that, and we're trying to turn around that application in 4 days. So we're doing our best on top of having all these things, but we are starting to get some traction on some of the changes that you all championed through your ordinances, and so we will be trying to come back and do a presentation on that. Separately, after the new council is seated, we do hope to have kind of a governance meeting, kind of retreat with the Planning Commission and all of us. So look forward to that, and we'll be sending you some dates.
And I would like to say something. I and our new commissioner both attended as Noah offered to us. We attended the conference, the Planning Commissioners Conference at Sonoma State College last Saturday. And it was, as always, really compelling and stimulating for me anyway. It was excellent, really interesting presentations, and it's really fun to meet other planning commissioners and the students. It was exciting for me. I don't know, maybe you'll have more to say, but I wanted to thank Noah and thank the city for making that possible. So thank you.
I will budget for that every year, so I encourage commissioners to go. It's a great experience. I unfortunately came down with a cold on Saturday and it did not attend, but it was really good from what I've heard.
I went sailing. So, I see the agenda says that our next regular meeting is scheduled for December 18th, but we have canceled that, have we not? Or
We have
on?
not. We have not. We did not cancel any meetings through December, so we do have items. We will be having a presentation or a couple items on December 18th, so look
Awesome.
forward to that.
That was a dream of yours. That you had.
Yeah, apparently. But, it must have been one of those Bob Dylan dreams. Doesn't go the way it should. So, with that said, adjourned.